Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tea Time with the Robert H. Jackson Center. Thank you for joining us again on Thursday for tea. With me today is the Attorney General of the state of New Jersey, General Gurbir Grewal. General Grewal, nice to see you.
Very nice to see you again, Kristan.
And today we're going to be discussing pandemic justice and access to justice. I think that we should start with how is New Jersey adapting to this remote working, courts being closed? What are some of the challenges that you're seeing and noticing, and how are you adapting?
So, first and foremost, Kristan, thanks for having me here. It's an honor to be included in this event by your center, named after someone who I have a lot of admiration for, that we were talking about offline. With respect to adapting to the current pandemic, it's been challenging. It's been challenging in a number of ways. I think first and foremost, from my perspective as Attorney General, I have a responsibility for nearly 7,700 people in my department, and the lawyers who do the work of the state, including our prosecutors and our civil lawyers, didn't have any experience in telecommuting or teleworking. And so, despite our best efforts over the last several years to get them that ability, we didn't have it. And then COVID hit, and our state has been hit particularly hard as compared to other states and compared to some countries. And we had to pivot very quickly in a matter of days to bring people out of our offices, to shift to a telework environment, and then to figure out how do we get 500 plus lawyers who do the civil work of the state, hundreds of prosecutors in my own office, and then our county prosecutors as well, the ability to telework. And so I don't know how we did it, but we got them online at home. In the meantime, our courts were closed. Our Chief Justice, our Administrative Office of Courts on the state side, our federal courts closed down the courts given what was happening in our state. And I think then we use that transition period to figure out, what do we do from here? Where do we go from here? How do we pivot to going to telework and doing virtual proceedings? Because this is going to be here for a while. And as we were all trying to figure this out as a nation, it became apparent to us that the rate of infection, the rate of death was not slowing in my state. So we had to figure out, how do we go to the virtual proceedings? And that's what we did. We wanted to prioritize those criminal proceedings that needed to move quickly, those civil proceedings that needed to move more quickly, and then obviously things that we put on hold that we're not able to do virtually, the trials, the grand juries. And so that's what we've done. We've tried to strike a balance, and we're still not fully open in our courts. We're able to get emergency orders on the civil side. We're able to have emergency arguments. Our Supreme Court has is meeting virtually. So those type of appellate arguments are happening. But on the criminal side, it still presents a problem. We're getting search warrants virtually. We're getting warrants signed virtually. Initial presentments are happening virtually. Some sentencings are happening, some guilty pleas, but not at the rate we need them to keep our criminal justice system moving in the state.
If I remember reading sometime in the last 2 weeks, you were also experimenting with virtual grand juries. Or at least setting up a pilot system to see how that would work. How is that working? There's a lot of confidentiality concerns with that, among other things.
Well, there are certainly a whole number of concerns when it comes to virtual grand juries. And just to put it in perspective, in the federal system, obviously some of our U.S. attorneys' offices and federal courts have moved to virtual grand juries a little bit more easily. They have found conference rooms where they will split up the various grand jurors and put witnesses in different conference rooms. The challenge at the state level is, as opposed to the federal system where you might be doing in New Jersey, let's say 1,000 cases a year, in the state system on a given year, a 12-month period, we do about 27,000 indictments in an average year. And so, and that's across New Jersey. And so it's simply not possible to space people out and do it in the same way some of our counterparts in the federal system are doing. And similarly, grand jurors in a state that we have nearly 12,000 COVID-related deaths, unfortunately, people don't want to go to the courthouses and to sit. So, the Supreme Court, our Chief Justice came with the proposal, let's see if we could pilot virtual grand juries. And the concerns there as a prosecutor are many. One is the secrecy of grand jury proceedings. From my perspective, I don't know how many of these with the Jackson Center that you've had where maybe one of your guests has a kid walk by behind them or somebody pop in or a phone ring. Can you imagine if you're a grand juror sitting at home and your kids are walking in and a family member's walking in? The cornerstone of the grand jury process is secrecy. And so for presenting witnesses or presenting confidential informants or presenting a victim of domestic violence, you could imagine, how important it is to the witness to maintain the secrecy of the proceedings. So that's a challenge. I don't think there's an easy answer there. But also from a justice point of view, what about access to technology? So if you're impaneling a grand jury, you want that composition of that grand jury to be reflective of the community in which it serves or in the state in which it serves. And if you're a defendant and you have a grand jury that's composed of only people that could afford the technology, you're leaving out certain disadvantaged communities and minority populations, and the composition of the grand jury is compromised. So there's a whole host of Fifth Amendment issues there I see, and a whole host of later down the road, Sixth Amendment issues when it comes to how things are being delayed. So, we've piloted it, a couple of our counties, and the challenge really has been the technology, freezing up, the confidentiality, the secrecy. But more importantly, defendants are not signing the waivers to proceed using that process because, they just don't want to do it. And so unless there's a waiver as a prosecutor, what is the benefit of doing this if it's only going to be challenged later and further delay proceedings later once a case is indicted? So we continue to work at it in fear of the next wave of COVID, but we're also hopeful that we'll get to a point where we perhaps can get back together in bigger rooms and bigger settings and do these in person.
Well, and so you mentioned the Sixth Amendment, and since there are a lot of non-lawyers in our audience, some of those primary rights there are the right to a criminal proceeding to face your accuser, the right to a speedy and public trial. Those two, especially in a pandemic, seem to be at odds with each other. You could possibly do speedy, but you can't necessarily do in face. And if you're trying to do in person, then it may not be speedy.
That's exactly right. I mean, right now, everything is on hold, by order of the court. We have constitutional considerations at the state level. We have a speedy trial, equivalent speedy trial act at the state level under our criminal justice reform statute, which was enacted several years ago. We have certain markers, much like the federal system, that we have to hit. Right now, all of that is on hold. And so the speedy is not there. And, if you're talking about virtual trials, which we're also looking at, it's cross-examining somebody in front of a jury that's spread out, that might be 15 feet away from the witness as opposed to the jury box being closed and they're not able to see the reaction. There are so many issues raised by just the setting, even if you're able to do it in person. And certainly they're compounded if you're doing a fully remote criminal trial, which we're not even considering at this point. We're considering spacing them out in our courtrooms and figuring out ways in which we can do that with masking, with having witnesses spread out. And so, a whole host of challenges. I don't, to be candid, I don't know how it resolves, but we're willing to explore any possibility right now because that's what this moment requires of us to keep this process moving. And also add on grand juries. There are cases that we need the grand jury as an investigative tool. And so we can't ask for subpoenas to be returned to a grand jury if there are no grand juries in session. So it's not just the indictment piece of it, it's the investigation piece of it, and then it's the rights of the defendant on the back end as trials are being delayed and people are being held in jail in some cases for extended periods of time.
Mhm. Well, and then there's also obviously, hard to escape the news about all of the unrest going on at the moment across the country. You
Yeah.
spoke virtually to the Assistant Prosecutors Association, I think I'm remembering that correctly, of New Jersey, a couple weeks ago, and really said that justice right now is forcing us to get uncomfortable and or requires us to be uncomfortable for right now. And you listed a number of ways that focus is shifting, and some of those discomforts. Would you mind sharing them again?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly with the COVID-19 pandemic, I said to the assistant prosecutors from across the state that we can't just bury our heads in the sand right now and hope things get better and hope that the system picks up again and hope that we'll return to indicting cases as we did and that everything will be back to normal quickly. It's not. And for us to deliver justice, which is our job as prosecutors in this particular moment, we've got to get outside of our comfort zones and do things we would not consider in normal times. And that started at the very first point of entry into the criminal justice system with our law enforcement officers who are enforcing our criminal laws on the street. If you flash back to March in my state and most other states, our cops didn't have sufficient personal protective equipment. They didn't have all the tools they needed to protect themselves against COVID-19. And so we said to them, we realize that and we're working on that. And our priority is to keep you safe and our community safe. So how do we balance public health and public safety in that context? Well, we said right now, justice requires us to have you focus on the most serious offenses. So if you've got that old bounce check case or that old fraud case and it doesn't present an immediate threat to public safety, you know what, just mail a summons and tell them to come in at a future date. Don't put yourself at risk by going out there to arrest that person, bring them back, process them in close quarters, and perhaps expose yourself to infection. And reserve that PPE for that serious case where you're responding to a domestic violence scene and you've got to get a bad person out of that setting and then process them and hold them. So, in ordinary times, I wouldn't tell cops to delay arresting people. But now, in the midst of COVID-19, that's what justice requires of us as prosecutors, as law enforcement officers. And the same thing talking about when we flash forward to the grand jury process. I take no great comfort in exploring this, but right now justice requires us to explore things that we wouldn't consider in normal times. But most important, in March, we were having flare-ups of COVID-19 in our jails. And that's where I really talked to them about this issue. I said, in ordinary times, I would not ask you, and in ordinary times, I would not enter into a consent decree with the ACLU and the public defender, not fight this out, but come in and come up with a solution to say, how do we bring down the jail population in our state? These are not the prison population, the jail population where people are held pretrial, where people are held on sentences of less than a year or as a condition of a probation violation. Let's figure out how we bring that population down and take out of that setting the least violent of those offenders. And so our jails can space out, so our guards can be safer, so we could slow the spread of COVID in our jails. And we did that. In a matter of a week, we released 700 low-level inmates, kept the most dangerous folks in our county jails, and told them, you're going to come back and serve those county jail sentences at the other side of this pandemic. And so that's what I mean about getting uncomfortable. And it continues to the current situation as well with the social unrest we're seeing in the wake of the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis last week. Yep. To deliver justice right now, we've got to get uncomfortable as well. Getting uncomfortable means we can't get outside of our offices and hold community meetings, but it's engaging with the community and hearing the anger that's out there and telling community members that you see them, that you hear them, that you share their anger and you share their commitment to moving towards justice, because that's what this moment also requires. Our traditional law enforcement approaches weren't working. The criminal justice system wasn't working for everybody as it should. That's what's coming to a head right now in the wake of these protests, and also requires us to get uncomfortable.
Yes, absolutely. And I recall reading some reports this week, Trenton having a harder time, Newark, which has a history of racial riots and racial violence, actually doing better. And at least the news reports I was reading seem to attribute that to what you were just describing as the power's willingness to get out into the community and listen, but also the community members' willingness to stand and say, no, not this, we're not going to break this window. We're going to protest in this way, which I have to imagine is, it is very community specific. You have to have built that trust up in the community that they understand that that the powers that be are there to help them, the police, the administrations, the justice system in general. And that's showcasing some of those breaks or some of those places where that trust has not yet been established.
I think that's exactly right. But I think this is where it's not just community by community in New Jersey. I think this is where New Jersey stands apart from the rest of the country. For a state of 9 million residents, tightly packed into a small geographic region, knock on wood, you have not seen the type of disruption and protests and violence that you're seeing in other parts of the country. We've had over 80 plus protests to date, and I think 2 had some indication of violence attendant to them. 2 out of so many, and the rest have been largely peaceful. And in many, you've had law enforcement officers, police chiefs like Joe Wysocki in Camden, New Jersey, a city that has a long history in the past of being one of the most dangerous places in America, walking with protesters. You don't go from one of the most dangerous cities in America decades ago to a place where the police chief is walking with protesters and there is no violence in the wake of what we've seen across the country without putting in hard work. And I think that's what we've done in New Jersey. Since I became Attorney General, I mandated quarterly community meetings by our county prosecutors and local law enforcement. We have 21 counties, so that's 4 meetings in each county. That's 84 meetings across the state, but as a starting point. So we've had hundreds of meetings where we've gotten uncomfortable, where we've had these uncomfortable conversations in the community, in the school gymnasiums, in the church basements, in the community centers, to talk about these tough issues. Years ago, we started talking about use of force. We started talking about implicit bias. We started talking about how we investigate officer-involved shootings. We talked about substance abuse issues. So we're out there all the time doing that hard work. And I think we put in a lot of deposits into that reservoir of trust and credibility and goodwill that we have with the community that we were calling upon in the wake of this national tragedy and saying, listen, in New Jersey, we do it a little differently. We're going to be out there in the communities with you, because I don't think you've seen that in any other state at the scale you see it in New Jersey, where chiefs are out there and prosecutors are out there with community members working together saying, hey, we were working towards this criminal justice reform, this reform to policing well before the events of this week, and we'll continue to work towards that same goal well after the events of this week settle down, because we share that commitment to justice.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think what you just said there is really important, because it's not only putting the work in leading up to this moment, but it's also obviously people are watching you, the collective you, now to see how you are reacting. Are you actually living what you said you would do? Are the police really there to help? Are they there to support? Or are they flipping a switch in this instance? That would set potentially things backwards. And so it sounds, at least in New Jersey, that not only was that trust built, but that they are continuing on that path as well, because they are living what they said.
They absolutely are. And I couldn't be more proud of the 36,000 cops in New Jersey that they have demonstrated remarkable engagement with their communities at this time. They've demonstrated remarkable restraint in very difficult situations, and they've demonstrated a commitment to continue moving towards justice in this state, understanding that things have not always gone well in that area. But we're trying to fix it. We're trying to correct it. In December of last year, I announced something that was called Excellence in Policing. It was an initiative where we were going to change how we train law enforcement officers, implement police licensing and certification for the first time in New Jersey, where we outlined how we investigate a 10-step process for investigating police use of force cases, including fatal use of force cases. We talked about how we reformed the internal affairs process, and we're going to issue new guidelines there. And we talked about all the other steps that we were committed to taking in this state towards professionalism in law enforcement, transparency and accountability, on how we would share information with the public in certain sensitive investigations involving use of force. So, we understood that the longer you sit on videos and recordings, that trust builds, that trust dissipates and mistrust builds, as we saw in Chicago in the wake of the Laquan McDonald case. And so we started that in December. During the events that are going on right now, we updated the public on where we stand and where we're going on those initiatives. On Tuesday, I sat with the governor to talk about where we're going on use of force in this state. Our use of force guidelines in this state haven't been revised in 20 years. They were revised last in June of 2000. And so we made a public commitment that the work we started in December on use of force is continuing. And by the end of this year, we will have a new use of force policy in the state. We will have in place a portal by which we have all our departments reporting electronically, so we have visibility and can hold bad actors accountable, and that we could share that publicly, some aspect of that data, again, for transparency. And I think all of those steps have occurred with the buy-in of law enforcement, which is what sets New Jersey apart in many ways, because we believe here in New Jersey that systemic change requires that systemic buy-in of law enforcement, of community, of all stakeholders. And that's why I think, again, going back to your earlier question, that's why I think New Jersey is a little bit different than other states as to what we're seeing right now. And I hope it stays that way going through this weekend. But, we've worked too hard to let the criminal acts of 4 cops in Minneapolis bring us down. And we're going to continue to move forward in that regard.
Well, and then I think we should also touch on the continuing outreach to the victims and the families of the victims. So I have to imagine that just from a balancing, so going back a little bit to our process conversation a little bit ago, first of all, letting them know that this is now going to be slower than they might have intended. Those must be challenging conversations to have, but they are absolutely necessary.
100%. In anything that we do, when I talk about systemic change just now with our use of force policies and policing practices, we engage with stakeholders to include victims' rights advocates. And in our own office, I oversee the Victims' Crimes Compensation Office. So we're our first stop for victims to get the resources they need, in the wake of a criminal event. And that's been a challenge to continue to provide those services in this particular environment. How do people submit claims for housing? How do they submit claims for other essentials they may need as a victim of a crime? But we have a pretty robust victim witness system in this state by statute. I brought in someone to revamp it across our department and to make it better. So I'm lucky to have a woman named Elizabeth Rubin, who really runs point as the person to coordinate victim services in my office and see how we can do that better, from whether it's continuing to get the grant money that's available in the wake of COVID and the victim of crimes grant money that's out there. But a lot of it is also just making those phone calls and letting victims of crimes know that there are people being released temporarily from jail and engaging with them, and letting them know also that, their abuser is in jail and that court date's going to come at a later date, and to keep them updated. And so by statute, we have to do that. But we do that well in this state. And that's something that is challenging right now, but we're continuing to do.
It sounds as if those connections with the victims' rights organizations are also very crucial to this.
Yeah, I mean, they're key stakeholders in the criminal justice system. And so, whenever we're considering any type of policy reform, any type of change in position, they're an important stakeholder to have at the table with us. And that's, again, part of the collaborative approach that we're employing here in New Jersey when it comes to criminal justice reform.
Great. Are there certain populations, pandemic or not, that are finding it harder to access the justice system? I'm thinking of lower income families, undocumented. These have all been traditionally challenged in accessing justice. Are you seeing anything in particular there with some of the marginalized populations?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly marginalized populations, it's always a challenge to, and particularly you're talking about immigrant communities. New Jersey is a highly diverse state, and we have one of the largest immigrant populations in the country. And so early on during our time here, when we talk about building trust, we specifically built trust with our immigrant communities. We introduced something called the Immigrant Trust Directive at a time of heightened federal immigration enforcement. There was a lot of confusion in the state and a lot of mistrust of state law enforcement, thinking that a call to the local police department to report an abuser would result in someone's deportation if they didn't have status. And so we spent a lot of time reassuring and establishing that trust. And so I think that trust those efforts have helped maintain those types of contacts to report crime. The area where I see the biggest challenge, however, again, it could overlap with marginalized communities, but is in categories of crimes. And it would be domestic violence or the abuse of children. Because I think that same isolation that we are pushing to push back this pandemic, that same stay-at-home order that's allowing us to slow the spread, or that same social distancing that's allowing us to slow the spread in our state, and we've been successful with it, is creating an ideal environment for an abuser to take advantage of their victim. So when you're in close quarters at home, we know during the holiday seasons, calls for domestic violence hotlines increase, reach out to law enforcement increases. So you would expect to see the same thing during this period of isolation, and we're not. Our numbers and reports of domestic violence incidents are going down in the state and have been going down. So early on during the pandemic, we did a lot of proactive messaging to go to grocery stores or pharmacies, for example, where people would still be going during the stay-at-home period, to put resources there or to equip pharmacists and other grocery chains on how they could give resources to someone who wanted to report domestic violence. We provided information on Facebook and social media about how you could text a crisis hotline. And it's not working as we hoped it would. The numbers are coming up, but still there's a gap there in the reporting, which is concerning me, both on domestic violence and the abuse of children. And I expect that to go up as the economic situation worsens too. And so that's the particular concern I have right now with the reporting of crime or access to justice.
And how are you thinking about addressing that? Is it more a matter of getting more information out so people understand what resources are available? Is it different avenues?
Yeah, and I think it's all of that, Kristan. I think, we've been trying to push out on social media platforms, like I said, non-traditional places where we could provide information. We partnered with various agencies of state to get creative. We went to our COVID-19 testing sites to provide information there and have resources there. And I think part of it is, when we think about courts being closed, now can I go get a restraining order against my abuser? Well, since courts are closed, in some senses, that's more difficult. They're open virtually, and they're open for certain applications. But we've messaged out there that someone can still go to a police station to get that type of restraining order, or if they want to get a TERPO or ERPO, which we call it, which is a protective order where, someone wants to get guns removed from a house or report somebody who might be a danger to themselves and have firearms. All those types of relief is available to folks at police stations, but then there's a stigma of going to a police station as opposed to a court. And so, I think a lot of it is the proactive messaging. We've partnered, and again, this is not so much getting outside of our comfort zone. This is something we've been doing all along, that we've torn down a lot of silos, and we work hand in hand with a lot of victim rights advocates and a lot of the Coalition to End Domestic Violence here in New Jersey to work on this messaging together. I believe one of our first virtual town halls that we did, we've done 7 so far, or 6 so far, was on the issue of domestic violence reporting. And so, that's part of it. And I think part of it is for those who might not be victims, but know people who are in difficult situations, to just reach out and make contact with folks and make sure they're in touch with friends and family members and loved ones where they might suspect this type of abuse.
And I have to imagine also just in terms of learning, it sounds certainly from the way that you are describing that New Jersey is doing a lot of things that have garnered positive results, have strengthened their ties with the community. This has just occurred to me out of curiosity. Is there sort of a collective of attorneys general who share information with each other, best practices? How is information shared with other states' attorneys general?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like many other attorneys general, I sort of have a unique position among the other attorneys general. There's, I think, maybe 5 or 6 of us that are not elected. There are 2 associations. There's the DAGA, 3 associations. There's DAGA, the Democratic AGs Association, RAGA, the Republican AGs Association, and then there's the Collective Association, NAG. It's the worst acronym ever.
That one always makes me chuckle, yes.
Yeah, which is the National Association of Attorneys General. And so they're clearinghouses. NAG does a great job, like, for example, pushing out COVID-19 related information that we're pursuing. And then, ideologically, the DAGA group pushes out some of the progressive policies that we're pursuing here. The challenge is that I'm not an active participant in DAGA because I'm not elected. And so my ethics rules prevent me from attending a number of their meetings, participating on calls. I'm not allowed to participate in fundraising or anything that touches on anything political in that regard, which is great because I don't have to raise money. I don't have to, cater to a particular constituency. I have the luxury, unlike some elected officials, of just doing whatever I believe the right thing is without seeing how it polls. And so, I think those organizations provide me a way to share information that about work I'm doing and get some information about other AGs. And then there's informal networks that form around policy issues. We call each other. I had an AG from the Midwest call me and ask me, well, hey, you were sharing information with law enforcement about how, where COVID-19 positive patients might reside, right? This was something we felt we had to do anonymously and in a way that we could share privacy or protect privacy concerns early on. So when there was a call for service at a particular house, it could show up as a flag, put on the PPE. And so, we shared that bit of information. Another AG called me on use of force recently because they saw a press release. So some of it is very informal and just based on the relationships you develop with your fellow AGs. So it's a great group, and there's a lot of collaboration and collaboration across the aisle as well.
Are there learnings that you're taking away from what other attorneys general are doing or how other states are handling the riots, their community relations, that you're adding to your arsenal as well?
I just want to plug my mug for a second. It's interesting. The other way in which I'm different from other AGs, in addition to not being elected, is that my responsibilities are greater. There are not many AGs that have complete criminal authority like I do. And so I have complete oversight because of the way we're structured and organized in New Jersey over law enforcement operations. And so I have oversight over the 21 county prosecutors in my state. I have oversight over law enforcement in the sense that I issue directives and set standards for training and related guidance. I am de facto chair of the Police Training Commission. And so that's a big responsibility. And it's a big, it provides an opportunity also for me to pursue some of the issues that I talked about when it comes to policing reform, of issuing just with the signature an attorney general directive saying, okay, today we're going to change our release of body cam footage policy across the state to all 500 plus police departments. So I could do that. I choose not to exercise it that way. I choose to be that collaborator I talked about earlier, to hear from different points of view and then formulate policy. But that's not an authority that many, if I don't believe any other AGs have. And so that's why it's a little bit different on the on that side of it. Some AGs have some criminal authority, and of course, more broadly speaking about messaging and community engagement and the types of forums we're holding that don't touch on law enforcement execution and policy. We share information, and I look to what some of the other leaders do across the river with Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, who's a terrific friend and partner. We share our playbook with Tish James across the river on the other side. Maura Healy, who's in Massachusetts, shares her playbook, and we steal from it or borrow from it when it comes to consumer protection and other messaging that we should be doing during COVID. And you'll see that a lot, that there is no pride in ownership here, and there's no fear of plagiarism here. We borrow heavily from each other, and we try not to reinvent the wheel where we don't need to.
Makes sense. All right, so we're going to give people an opportunity to ask some questions. I do use this time while they're formulating that to talk about the tea. So today I went with a tea called Iron Goddess of Mercy, because both strength and mercy seemed relevant to a discussion about justice.
I went with a tea called LaCroix.
Yeah, nice. Very bubbly. Very bubbly.
Very bubbly. Yeah, effervescent.
All right, General, we have some questions. So from Alexander Jordan Baker, we have a couple, and he said, will there start being a residency requirement for police officers to live in the cities that they are policing?
I know that's a big push nationally, and the thought behind it is rightfully so that, if a police officer lives in the city, they're going to act and behave a different way. And they're also going to know the residents better and the community better and serve the community better. The challenge is in New Jersey, you have 565 municipalities, you have over 500 police departments, and then you have civil service rules. The way our state is organized, and some municipalities pass residency requirements, some municipalities don't. So there's no consistency there. And the other challenge is that if you're having residency requirements, or if you're only hiring residents, and you're a municipality of 10 or 20 or 500, let's say, and no one wants to be a cop in that that area, right? Mm-hmm. That presents a challenge. So what a lot of big municipalities do is that they make preferences for residents, and then they go off that list, and then they go to a secondary list of non-residents and prioritize their hiring of residents first. But there are a lot of complicating civil service rules and other issues that affect that. So I understand the concern, I understand the push for it, but there are a lot of challenges that make that more difficult.
And he also asked that since you were talking about the police being certified, just curious as to when that actually goes into effect, that certification process.
Yeah, great question. So, right now, if you graduate from one of our PTC certified academies, you get your PTC certification, and that's the last piece of paper you get. And so the fear and the challenge and the reality sometimes is that you have a problem officer who might be terminated from agency A or threatened with termination, who just agrees to resign and then is hired by agency C 100 miles away in a different part of the state and starts there. And unless there's some meaningful due diligence done and IA files passed and conversations had, you could somehow allow a problem officer to go from one agency to the next, which is in no one's interest. So in December, I asked the PTC to look at licensing as a reality in New Jersey if it was feasible, and to report back to me by June. They've done that. They have a meeting in mid-June where they're going to put forward a recommendation for a licensing scheme. And I'm going to vote in favor of that recommendation as a chair. It's my firm belief that it'll pass. And once that happens, we're going to then start the process through regulations, and if there's lawmaking that's required, to put in the requirements of what certification and licensing in New Jersey means, what the annual training requirements will be, what the conditions for revocation would be, what the conditions for suspension would be. And that's going to have to be, again, the type of collaborative process I talked about. So that will hopefully get underway in June and I couldn't put an end on it, but I want to resolve it as quickly as possible. We've been talking about police licensing in Jersey since 2004. I don't want it to wait another 16 years, and it won't.
And in case you're free this Sunday from 2 to 4, you're also invited to the Trenton City Hall for a meeting with the residents.
Oh, okay. Who's that from?
That's also from Alexander Jordan Baker.
Okay. I don't know if I am, but I'll have to ask my wife and 3 kids.
Got it. All right. So we have a question from Helena. Can you explain why your consent decree with the public defenders was not only compassionate with regard to the dangers of COVID-19, but also address the potential 15th and or 14th Amendment violations?
I'm not sure I follow.
I think looking for, so what were some of the 5th and 14th Amendment violations that were at issue for the pretrial detainees, the 700 or so who were released? What were some of the considerations? You had mentioned that you made recommendations against certain releases. And I think she's just trying to get a sense of the balance of what went into those deliberations.
Sure, because there are some, and I don't know if she's confusing the prison, in the prison system with the Department of Corrections, there was an executive order the governor issued to come up with a framework for the release of those inmates who are sentenced to our state prisons. And there are lists that the Department of Corrections compiles and works with the parole, the parole commission in Jersey to identify those who are vulnerable, medically infirm. So there's 4 lists. So I think based on the terminology she's talking about, that she might be referring to that process, and that there were opportunities for prosecutors to interpose objections to the release of somebody, victims, and there's a question right now presently before the Supreme Court in which we've weighed in as the lawyers for the Department of Corrections on whether more process needed to be attached to that particular framework. So that's not the process I was talking about earlier. The county jails, these are sentenced county jail inmates who are serving sentences of a year or less. So we didn't prioritize for medical infirmity in that case or not. It was a matter of just bringing the population down and taking low-level offenders out of that environment to bring the population down and have the ability to make objections to keep somebody in. We came up with lists of people who would be eligible. There were categories of crimes that were excluded, but we came up with lists, and prosecutors still were able to object on dangerousness grounds or object on maybe there was a restraining order or domestic violence issues or perhaps even substance abuse issues. Because one of the things that we also did was make sure we connected people to services on the outside. In some cases, people didn't want to take the benefit of the release because they had better services inside to deal with some of the issues that they were dealing with. So I think that the viewer is probably talking about the state prison process, given the due process questions they're asking about, and that the Supreme Court just heard arguments on, I think 2 weeks ago, and is going to resolve fairly shortly.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. Another question from Alexander. To make officers more accountable, what are your thoughts on doing away with qualified immunity for police?
That is a complicated issue for sure, and it's one that we've started to examine, just not with a view on one side of it or the other, but just to look at. So I don't have a fully formed opinion on that at this point. We have certainly pushed for accountability measures by making sure that we're tracking, for example, use of force better, by having early warning systems in place to identify problematic behavior earlier, by reforming our internal affairs process, by instituting a pretty robust process. We had legislation in the state that required me to investigate every fatal officer-involved encounter or shooting, as well as every death in custody. But we went above and beyond that by creating a directive in our state to say we're going to pull together the patchwork of these types of cases and come up with a comprehensive framework where we're presenting all of these to the grand jury, and here's the 10 steps we're going to follow to do so, again, for increased accountability. And then the other thing we did, listen, I even to avoid completely at some point the question of even invoking qualified immunity and raising red flags, what if we fix the problem on the front end? What if we, instead of early warnings went to early intervention systems? What if we focused on mental health and officers and really tore down the stigma associated with seeking help as a police officer? Because it's a very real issue. So in October of last year, I launched a statewide resiliency program for law enforcement, recognizing that officer suicide and mental health issues were a problem and might be contributing to bad behavior. And so we came up with a framework where all of our 500 plus departments in the state would have resiliency program officers and master resiliency trainers that would train officers on techniques to spiral up in the face of adversity instead of spiraling down, but also be a point of contact if somebody needed to seek help to address an issue. And it's my hope, by also focusing on that side of it, that we address the well-being and the mental well-being of our officers, that we avoid the question that Alexander had on the back end, which is, whether we should be invoking qualified immunity or not. So, it's not one or the other. It's not mutually exclusive. It's a holistic approach to improving policing in New Jersey.
Well, and it sounds certainly as if the breadth of your responsibilities gives you, if not necessarily unique, certainly a rare opportunity to have that holistic impact, because you do sort of oversee the entirety of the process.
Yeah, and I might add that we've been able to do this, and if Alexander, it sounds like he's in the Trenton area. There are certainly a lot of problems in policing across the country, and there are certainly problems in policing in New Jersey. But I would challenge somebody to identify a state that has done more when it comes to progressive policies in criminal justice reform and in policing reform. We instituted criminal justice reform to move from a cash-based system of bail to a risk-based system before a lot of other states did, and we're a model in that regard. We have pushed forward very, very thoughtful and progressive policies on body cams, early warnings, mandatory drug testing, use of force now, officer resiliency, immigrant trust, you name it. A policy to deal with the transgender community. Just really, I think, meaningful and relevant and required policies that a lot of other departments and a lot of other states can't do on a statewide level in the way we're doing it. And we're doing it without legislation. We're doing it. We're affecting this systemic change with systemic buy-in. We're doing it by sitting. Let me just even back up a moment. When we're talking about some of these policies on the internal affairs guidelines, you have meetings with the police unions, the ACLU, and other stakeholders sitting at the same table. When you're coming up with the immigrant trust directive, you have Make the Road, you have ACLU, you have police unions, you have community activists, leaders sitting at this table, and everyone's not leaving happy, which in my mind means that we're striking a balance and developing good policy. So I think we're doing quite a bit here. I mean, one of the other things we did is this week announced that we're going to try to roll out crisis intervention team training statewide. This is equipping our officers with de-escalation techniques that they could bring to a situation where somebody might be experiencing a mental health crisis to bring resolve the situation without the use of force. And so these are the types of forward-leaning, progressive policies that we're able to implement, again, here in New Jersey, without legislation in a collaborative manner. And that's why I think, you're having that type of reform, and you're changing culture too, because you're getting that buy-in.
Well, and the only way to change some of the systemic problems is to tackle the system itself. And so I think that is an area where, for many reasons, has either proven challenging or unappetizing for a lot of attorneys general. All right, final question. What keeps you up at night regarding how justice is being administered at the moment?
What keeps me up at night regarding the administration of justice?
Yes.
I would say it's whether it's a tough one.
It can have a multi-part answer.
I think it's simple. I think, listen, we are dealing with so many issues in this state and across the country. And when I look back at the last 6 months, for example. We went from December. We had a violent mass shooting in Jersey City. And we went from that, responding to that, and dealing with that right into the COVID-19 pandemic, more or less. And so we've gone from COVID-19 to really, one of the most serious social justice crises and criminal justice crises that I've ever experienced in my lifetime. Maybe people, who are alive in the 60s can compare it to that moment. Then you graft on top of all of that almost an existential crisis we're dealing with as a country, where rules and norms that held us together for so many generations and centuries are now being tested when we're looking at the prospect of turning military on citizens and things that we thought we would never have to grapple with. So I think the answer is there's a lot that keeps me up at night. But I think the common thread to all of it is, am I doing enough to address all of those issues during the day? Have I done enough today to address criminal justice issues? Have I done enough engagement today to hear the anger that community members are rightfully expressing, that protesters are rightfully expressing right now, angers and calls for change? Have I done enough today to tell folks that I hear them, that I see them, and that we want to effect change and that we're partners with them? Have I done enough to keep our communities safe against that next lone wolf shooter who's going to come in? Have I done enough to fend off attacks from Washington when our citizens are affected by, on top of all this, rollbacks in environmental policies, on top of all of this, Title IX rules, which are making it more difficult for victims of sexual assault to move forward with their cases. So, I think it's always that question, given all the crises we're dealing with in this particular moment, which is a challenging moment for sure. Am I doing my part to keep the residents of my state safe at this time?
Thank you very much, General Grewal, for being with us today. For those of you who will be joining us for tea next week, we will be talking with Professor John Q. Barrett at St. John's Law School. We're going to be dipping back in history. As you know, this is the 75th anniversary of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. And this coming Sunday was the issue of one of Justice Jackson's major reports, setting up the London conference, his report back to President Truman. So we are going to dip into that history for next week. And then 2 weeks from now, we will actually be talking about prisoners' rights in the pandemic and with Margaret Schlanger. So I look forward to seeing all of you over the next couple of weeks. And General Grewal, again, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Kristan, and be well and stay safe.
Thank you.